Welcome to the Cleveland Harbor Dredge Material Management Plan virtual public information session. We appreciate your attendance and your interest in this project. For opening remarks, I'd like to introduce the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Buffalo District Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Burnham.
Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rob Burnham, Commander of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Buffalo District. Our district mission supports the Great Lakes Navigation System, which encompasses federally maintained structures and navigation channels across the region. Every day, millions of tons of cargo flow through these waterways, and millions of people use them for recreation. They provide vital economic benefits to communities all across the country. That's why our ability to dredge sediments from the Federal Navigation Channel and harbors and rivers like yours, keeping them safe and clear for ships and boats, is critically important. Just as important is our ability to find suitable, sustainable locations to place those sediments. That's where a dredge material management plan comes in. Our team is hard at work on this project, but a solid, dependable plan relies on input from the public, partners, and key stakeholders in the community. If you're watching this, I know you're already interested in helping us find a solution, and I encourage you to share your comments with our team. Together, we can continue building strong in your community.
The goal of the Cleveland Harbor Dredge Material Management Plan, known in short as the DMMP, is to identify a 20-year plan for maintenance, dredging, and management of dredged sediment from the Cleveland Harbor Federal Navigation Channel. For this DMMP, we are seeking to accommodate 4.5 to 6.7 million cubic yards of material to be removed from the harbor between 2025 and 2044. In 2024, placement capacity for 225,000 cubic yards of material dredged between 2025 through 2029 was secured at the Port of Cleveland Sediment Management and Processing Facility, or SPMF. This facility is located at Confined Disposal Facilities, or CDFs, 9 and 12 through approval of a preliminary assessment. The current effort will focus on evaluation of options, known as alternatives, for implementation between 2030 and 2044. The Corps of Engineers has a long history of dredging operations in Cleveland Harbor. Dredging refers to the removal of sediment, like gravel, sand, or silt, from the bottom of a waterway to create or maintain sufficient depths for navigation or other purposes. The Corps of Engineers dredges portions of Cleveland Harbor Federal Navigation Channel twice each year, once in the fall and once in the spring. Throughout the dredging process, lake and river bottom sediments are scooped, scraped, or pumped by dredging vessels into barges, hoppers, or onshore facilities for placement. Dredging is important to maintain lakes, rivers, and harbors used for commerce, recreation, or defense transportation. Through maintenance dredging, the Corps of Engineers ensures that channel depths are suitable for large ships to move through safely. Dredging also provides for more efficient waterborne commerce compared to other transportation methods. To sustain important dredging operations and identify suitable dredge material management strategies, the DMMP will use a 6-step planning process. This process is iterative, meaning that we repeat certain steps throughout as conditions change or additional information is gathered. To date, the Cleveland Harbor DMMP has completed steps 1 through 3. In this presentation, I will share the problems and opportunities identified for this study and focus on the alternative plans that we have formulated to support continued dredging operations in Cleveland Harbor. The planning process is also integrated with the National Environmental Policy Act process, or NEPA. In this diagram, we are currently in the first public scoping period. We have characterized potential impacts associated with the alternatives under consideration, but have not determined if the potential impacts are significant. Significant environmental impacts will trigger an environmental impact statement, or EIS, and additional resources and scoping activities will be required after the Notice of Intent, or NOI, is published by the Corps of Engineers. If the potential impacts are not significant, we will continue to pursue an integrated DMMP and environmental assessment with a finding of no significant impact, or FONSI, documenting the agency decision. Throughout this process, there will be additional opportunities for feedback from the public and interested entities. Before we dive into this study, I want to provide some additional context on DMMPs in Cleveland Harbor specifically. As I mentioned previously, DMMPs identify dredge material management solutions to support construction and maintenance of a federal project over a minimum of 20 years. Through the DMMP process, the Corps of Engineers identifies both the federal standard and the base plan. The federal standard is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, as the least costly dredge material disposal or placement alternative that is consistent with sound engineering practices and meets all environmental requirements. The base plan is defined in the Corps of Engineers policy as the operational description of the federal standard that defines the disposal or placement options that are assigned to the navigational purpose of the project. So what does that mean? Basically, the federal standard and the base plan establish the maximum federal investment in dredge material management at the harbor. Costs above the base plan require a non-federal cost share partner and sponsor for the project. Beneficial use of dredge material is also critical to the DMMP process. Beneficial use is defined as the productive and positive use of dredge material, which covers broad use categories ranging from fish and wildlife habitat development to human recreation to industrial or commercial uses. In January 2023, the Chief of Engineers established a goal for the Corps to beneficially use at least 70% of its dredge material by 2030. Achievement of this goal requires innovation, planning, and partnership at all federal harbors. Currently, the Corps estimates about 30 to 35% of its dredge material is beneficially used. Now that we've set the stage a bit, let's zoom in on Cleveland Harbor. Cleveland Harbor is located on the south shore of Lake Erie at the mouth of the Cuyahoga River. The harbor includes a breakwater-protected outer harbor and an inner harbor consisting of improved navigational channels on the Cuyahoga River. The inner harbor includes the lower deep draft section of the Cuyahoga River and the connecting Old River. The Buffalo District also maintains the breakwater system and a pier system in Cleveland Harbor with federal funding, including East and West Arrowheads, East Breakwater, West Breakwater, West Spur Breakwater, East Pier, West Pier, and Buffalo District, Ohio Area Office Finger Pier. These structures protect the harbor shoreline and its docks and businesses along the lakefront, and aid navigation. Additional information about the harbor features is available in our scoping document posted online. A link to this document is also provided in the video description. The Cleveland-Cuyahoga County Port Authority, referred to as the Port of Cleveland, is the non-federal sponsor for Cleveland Harbor. As the non-federal sponsor, the Port of Cleveland shares the cost of important operation and maintenance activities for the harbor. Currently, the Port of Cleveland provides dredge material placement capacity in the non-federal CDF 12, as well as operates the SPMF at CDFs 9 and 12 that enable beneficial use of coarse-grained material from the harbor. As previously mentioned, the preliminary assessment finalized by the Corps of Engineers in 2024 identified dredge material management capacity for 225,000 cubic yards of material dredged between 2025 and 2029. This scenario is referred to as the minimalist or partial mission scenario because dredging is constrained by the available placement capacity. Under the minimalist scenario, the Corps of Engineers is able to dredge the river channel and spot dredge other critical areas to ensure safe and reliable navigation. However, this scenario does not enable the dredging of additional material that has accumulated in the channel since dredging was constrained in 2015. This additional material is referred to as the backlog. The Corps of Engineers has identified a need to dredge at least 300,000 cubic yards of material annually, beginning no later than 2030. This is referred to as the normal dredging or full mission scenario. Under the normal scenario, the Corps of Engineers is able to adequately dredge the harbor to support safe, reliable navigation while also reducing the backlog in the functional channel by about 50% over a 15-year period. Preliminary assessment finalized in 2024 identifies the federal standard and base plan as placement of 225,000 cubic yards of material per year in the Port of Cleveland CDF 12 through a partnership agreement known as a Section 217 agreement. Under the DMMP process, the Corps will strive to identify suitable dredge material management capacity for 300,000 cubic yards of material dredged between 2030 and 2044. Continued operation and maintenance of Cleveland Harbor is justified through economics. Based on 2022 Waterborne Commerce Statistics Center tonnage, Cleveland Harbor is the 6th busiest port on the Great Lakes and the 49th busiest port in the nation. From 2018 to 2022, the 5-year average for commodities transported through Cleveland Harbor was 11 million tons, 70% of which are receipts. The top commodities transported through Cleveland are iron ore, limestone, and cement and concrete. These commodities support a large integrated steel mill and a robust construction industry. With that, it's time to dig into the DMMP. The planning process starts by identifying the water resource problems that we are looking to address. For Cleveland Harbor, we have identified 4 major problems. First, continued sediment accumulation in the Federal Navigation Channel at Cleveland Harbor creates a need for regular maintenance dredging and dredge sediment management. This sedimentation is ongoing and expected to continue into the future, as no significant sediment reduction within the Cuyahoga River watershed is anticipated. Existing placement facilities within Cleveland Harbor cannot accommodate the full volume of material to be dredged over the 20-year period of analysis. As discussed previously, current operations target dredging 225,000 cubic yards of material from Cleveland Harbor per year based on the capacity available at the Port of Cleveland's SPMF and CDF 12. While the SPMF may provide capacity for coarse-grained material indefinitely, the capacity at CDF 12 is anticipated to be exhausted by 2029. Based on current dredging quantities and placement methods, existing placement facilities cannot provide capacity for dredged material through the 20-year planning period. Annual dredging volumes are insufficient to address the backlog of dredging at Cleveland Harbor. Since 2015, dredging at Cleveland Harbor has been constrained by the limited capacity available at placement facilities. Due to this constraint, the harbor and the entrance channel are dredged less frequently to ensure adequate capacity remains available to support higher priority sections of the channel, mainly the river portions. The current volume of annual dredging that occurs in Cleveland Harbor Federal Navigation Channel is limited to 225,000 cubic yards per cycle based on the capacity available at CDF 12 and the associated SPMF. This volume of dredging does not address the estimated 2 million cubic yards backlog of dredging that has accumulated since dredging has been constrained. Current dredge material management operations are not resilient and leave the harbor vulnerable to impacts from severe storms and other unforeseen sediment-inducing events, like bulkhead failure. The current dredging volumes and placement locations lack resiliency, and capacity is not available at existing placement facilities to support emergency dredging operations over the short or the long term. Once the problems we are trying to address have been identified and understood, we can frame the planning process through identification of opportunities or other considerations that may impact our decisions. Additional opportunities and considerations may be identified throughout the planning process. Opportunities for Cleveland Harbor DMMP include beneficial use of dredge material, increasing capacity of existing CDFs, and increasing the connection between nearby communities and Lake Erie. Considerations do not necessarily limit our planning process, but may impact our decision-making. Considerations including potential impacts to the Burke Lakefront Airport, real estate factors associated with potential solutions, and financial constraints or funding availability. Under the planning framework, we use the problems, opportunities, and considerations to develop our study objectives and constraints. The objectives specify what we are trying to achieve under the study. Objective statements are clearly linked back to the water resource problem and the city authority. For Cleveland Harbor DMMP, we have identified 3 objectives. Provide dredge material placement capacity to accommodate critical dredging needs at Cleveland Harbor. increase resiliency of dredging operations at Cleveland Harbor by providing capacity to accommodate material dredged for emergency response operations and backlog abatement, and maximize beneficial use of material dredged from Cleveland Harbor to the extent practicable. Constraints, on the other hand, are factors that limit the planning process. The Corps of Engineers recognizes universal constraints, such as compliance with environmental and cultural resource laws that apply to all studies and projects. We also identify specific constraints for each study. For Cleveland Harbor, one study-specific constraint has been identified. Alternatives must comply with Ohio Revised Code Section 6111.32. This provision of the Ohio Revised Code limits the volume of dredge material that can be placed in Lake Erie to 10,000 cubic yards per project, with several exceptions including beneficial use. Any alternative selected for recommendation must comply with this provision. Within the planning process, measures are discrete activities that contribute towards the planning objectives. Measures are screened based on study-specific criteria and then combined to formulate alternative plans. For Cleveland DMMP, measures generally fit into three categories: traditional placement, beneficial use of dredge material, and source reduction measures. Traditional placement describes those measures in which dredge material is placed somewhere without beneficial use, such as a CDF. Measures currently considered traditional placement methods are depicted on this slide in yellow. Beneficial use measures are shown in green and include commercial beneficial use, aquatic habitat restoration, beach or shoreline nourishment, upland or aquatic capping of contained sediments, and other innovative uses. Measures shown in blue are source reduction measures. These do not create additional dredge material capacity, but rather focus on reducing the overall volume of sediment requiring removal to ensure safe, reliable transportation through practices like watershed planning, sediment capturing, or dredging optimization. Measures were screened to determine whether or not they should be carried forward to plan formulation. Measures were primarily screened based on the extent to which each measure contributes to our objectives, specifically the relative capacity or dredging load reduction achieved by each measure and whether the measure would be considered beneficial use. Other screening considerations included the relative cost, timeline for implementation, and risk or uncertainty. This evaluation resulted in screening out the measures shown in gray on this slide. These measures may be considered in future planning efforts as appropriate. The remaining measures were combined into 11 unique alternative plans as shown on this slide. For the remainder of this presentation, I will briefly describe each alternative plan. The final slide will describe how you can share your input and feedback on these plans with our project team. The Corps of Engineers is required to consider the option of no action as one of the alternatives to comply with the requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, an applicable Corps of Engineers policy. No action assumes that no project would be implemented by the federal government to achieve the planning objectives. The no action alternative forms the basis against which all other alternative plans are measured. Under this alternative, dredging will remain limited to the available placement capacity. While the capacity remains available in CDFs at Cleveland Harbor, dredging operations will focus on critical areas for the navigation channel, and a backlog will continue to accumulate. Capacity would not be available for emergency dredging needs, and the harbor would remain vulnerable to sediment-inducing events. Capacity in all CDFs at Cleveland Harbor is currently anticipated to be exhausted by 2030. At this point, routine dredging operations may stop altogether. Without dredging, models suggest the harbor may become as shallow as 9.5 to 16.8 feet, depending on the location. The turning basin may become as shallow as 2 feet. These conditions may interrupt commercial navigation. Alternative 2 involves transportation and placement of all dredged sediment at the open water placement site, known as Claw 1, located about 9.5 miles north of the West Pier Light and shown in the blue polygon on this map. The Corps of Engineers has determined that the open water discharge of sediments dredged from the Upper River Channel at Claw 1 would not result in contaminant-related unacceptable adverse effects to the aquatic ecosystem. The Water Quality Standard in Ohio Revised Code Section 6111.32 limits the volume of dredged sediment placed into Lake Erie that the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, or Ohio EPA, can certify under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act unless it's beneficially used. This code provides for open water placement of up to 10,000 cubic yards in various types of beneficial uses of dredged sediment, including in the open water as aquatic beneficial use. Because this alternative considers placement of up to 300,000 cubic yards per year in the open lake, this alternative is not considered implementable at this time, but is retained for cost comparison purposes only. Alternative 3A strives to maximize the use of existing CDFs by increasing capacity available and leveraging the Port of Cleveland's SPMF on CDFs 9 and 12. To increase capacity, CDF 10B, shown in yellow on the map, will be expanded vertically through berm raising to the extent practicable, with considerations for operation at the Burke Lakefront Airport and geotechnical characteristics of the berm material. The additional capacity generated through vertical expansion will be calculated as plan formulation progresses. Additionally, this alternative includes excavation of dewatered and environmentally suitable material from CDF 10B for upland beneficial use. The material in CDF 10B will be sampled to analyze grain size and chemical composition, and this analysis will inform the types of beneficial use opportunities that can leverage materials from CDF 10B, such as brownfield reclamation or general fill material. One potential site under consideration is shown in red on the map and includes the use of material as general fill to support the City of Cleveland and Bedrock's Development's revitalization of the Cuyahoga River bank near Tower City. As appropriate beneficial use opportunities are identified, the Corps of Engineers will execute appropriate agreements with interested non-federal partners to transport and place material at these sites. Excavation of material from CDF 10B will increase the capacity available and enable continued placement of material at the CDF. Under this alternative, an average of 140 to 160,000 cubic yards of material will be placed annually at the port's SPMF on CDF 9 and 12, shown in green and orange respectively on the map. Material will then be hydraulically pumped into the sluiceways at CDF 9 for dewatering and hydraulic sorting. It will then be excavated and staged at CDF 12 for eventual off-site beneficial use. Placement of material at the port's SPMF will require a negotiated agreement with the Port of Cleveland, pursuant to Section 217 of the Water Resources Development Act of 1996. This alternative also includes the placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredged material annually in Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, which is north of the mapped area. Similar to Alternative 3A, Alternative 3B includes placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredged material annually into Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, as well as harvesting material from CDF 10B for upland beneficial use, with subsequent placement of material into CDF 10B as capacity is generated. This alternative beneficially uses coarse-grained material through littoral nourishment. Sediments within the upstream reach of the Upper River Channel in the harbor tend to possess a substantial coarse-grained fraction. This reach is located immediately downstream of the upstream Federal Navigation Project limit and can extend for over 1 mile. Recent data on sediments in this reach show them to be usually comprised of 60% or more of sand, with some small gravel at times. The total volume of coarse-grained material collected through maintenance dredging and available for placement in the littoral drift is still under evaluation. Suitable material will be placed directly below the ordinary high water mark at approved nearshore placement locations such as Perkins Beach or the Bracknell shoreline, shown in teal on the map. To provide capacity for the full dredging volume, this measure will be accompanied by other measures suitable for fine-grained material. As appropriate sites are identified in advance, this alternative considers beneficial use of dredged material for aquatic ecosystem restoration. In concept, dredged sediment from the Federal Navigation Channel that meets In-Water Placement Clean Water Act Section 404(b)(1) guidelines can be placed on the lake bed or nearshore areas to create suitable elevations that will support submerged aquatic vegetation and coastal wetland habitats. Typically, some sort of confinement, such as a stone breakwater, is necessary to protect the sediments from scour and maintain an elevation that will support the establishment of the desired ecological community. This approach to beneficial use has been applied in harbors in Buffalo, New York, and Ashtabula, Ohio. Alternatively, dredged sediment could be containerized in geosynthetic fabrics, also called geosynthetic containers, or GSCs, for placement in the deeper water. Conceptually, GSCs would be stacked in nearshore or deepwater areas to create increased bathymetric relief and would be topped with cobble or gravel to create aquatic reef or shoal habitat that will support fish spawning and rearing. This has been proposed at other Ohio harbors such as Fairport and Lorraine, but has not yet been implemented. While no sites or non-federal partners for aquatic ecosystem restoration opportunities in Cleveland Harbor has been identified as the date of this presentation, this measure continues to be considered for inclusion due to the potential to provide significant ecological benefits and capacity for dredged material. Alternative 4A includes placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredged material annually in Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, as well as placement of an average of 140 to 160,000 cubic yards of dredged material at the port's SPMF at CDFs 9 and 12 through a Section 217 agreement. To generate long-term capacity for fine-grained material, this alternative proposes partnership on the Cleveland Harbor Eastern Embayment Resilience Strategy, or CHEERS, concept. The footprint of the CHEERS concept is shown in pink on the map, and the current concept layout shown on the slide was retrieved from the Cleveland Metroparks website for the concept. The CHEERS concept presents a potential opportunity for future beneficial use of dredged sediment for aquatic ecosystem restoration, recreational, and community benefits. This concept was developed through partnership between the City of Cleveland, the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, Ohio Department of Transportation, the Port of Cleveland, and the Cleveland Metroparks. It seeks to improve the resilience of the eastern lakefront in Cleveland through the creation of 150 acres of coastal habitat, parkland, and green space. Detailed design and development of the CHEERS concept is underway by local partners, but the CHEERS concept is currently expected to provide capacity for approximately 4 million cubic yards of dredged material over the project lifespan. The CHEERS concept will also be able to accept fine and coarse-grained sediment depending on the location and phase of the project. To partner on design, implementation, or placement of dredged material at CHEERS, the Corps of Engineers must execute a Section 217 agreement with an eligible non-federal sponsor. Alternative 4B includes placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredged material annually in Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, shown in blue, as well as placement of coarse-grained material in the littoral drift at locations such as Perkins Beach and/or the Bracknell shoreline, shown in teal. Long-term beneficial use of fine and coarse-grained material would be achieved through partnership to create coastal aquatic habitat and recreational benefits through the CHEERS concept, shown in pink. Based on preliminary designs, the CHEERS concept can accept fine-grained material as general fill, but coarse-grained material may be required as top cover to achieve final design elevations. In these instances, coarse-grained material may need to be diverted from Littoral Nourishment to the CHEERS project. The details regarding coarse-grained material for this alternative will be further evaluated as the DMMP progresses. Alternative 5 uses measures that improve or restore aquatic habitats in and around Cleveland Harbor to yield the greatest uplift in habitat quality. This alternative includes placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredged material annually in Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, shown in blue, placement of coarse-grained material in the littoral drift at locations such as Perkins Beach or the Bracknell shoreline, shown in teal, beneficial use of dredged material for the aquatic ecosystem restoration pending site and non-federal partner identification, and the CHEERS concept, shown in pink. Alternative 6A includes placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredge material annually in Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, as well as placement of an average of 140 to 160,000 cubic yards of dredge material at the port's SPMF at CDFs 9 and 12, shown in green and orange, respectively, through a Section 217 agreement. To accommodate long-term dredge material management needs, this alternative proposes construction of a new CDF for Cleveland Harbor. The 2009 Cleveland Harbor DMMP fully evaluated a variety of measures to carry this measure out and recommended the construction of a new 157-acre CDF at the East 55th Street site, outlined in dark orange, with a capacity of 6.8 million cubic yards and an implementation cost of $313.1 million in 2009 dollars. This recommendation was not implemented due to the lack of a non-federal sponsor. The size, location, and cost of a new CDF would need to be reevaluated. However, this alternative has the potential to provide 20 years or more of dredge material sediment placement capacity and enable the Corps of Engineers to address the backlog of dredge material that has accumulated in recent years. Alternative 6B includes placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredge material annually in Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, shown in blue, as well as placement of coarse grain material in the Littoral drift at locations such as Perkin Beach or Bracknell, shown in teal. Long-term capacity for fine and coarse grain sediment will be generated through construction of a new CDF for Cleveland Harbor, shown in dark orange. Alternative 7 includes placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredge material annually in Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, harvesting of material from CDF 10B for upland beneficial use, potentially at the site shown in red, with subsequent placement of material into CDF 10B, shown in yellow, as capacity is generated, and development of a new sediment recycling facility. This alternative also relies upon significant capacity generated in CDF 10B to accommodate long-term dredging needs. Additionally, Alternative 7 incorporates efficiencies generated by locating the potential sediment recycling facility closer to the head of navigation, with a potential site shown in green. Implementation of an SPMF operation near the Cleveland Cliffs facility will reduce the time and labor associated with transporting coarse grain sediment, generally generated from the upper river channel, downstream to CDFs 9 and 12 for hydraulic sorting and beneficial use. This measure depends upon the availability of a suitable real estate and a non-federal interest in construction of a new SPMF for Cleveland Harbor. Alternative 8 seeks to maximize opportunities for beneficial use of dredge material over the 20-year planning period. This alternative includes placement of 10,000 cubic yards of dredge material annually in Lake Erie at the Claw 1 site, shown in blue, placement of coarse grain material in the Littoral drift at locations such as Perkins Beach and/or the Bracknell shoreline, shown in teal, beneficial use of dredge material for aquatic ecosystem restoration dependent upon site and non-federal sponsor availability, harvesting material from CDF 10B for upland beneficial use, potentially at the site shown in red, with subsequent placement of material into CDF 10B, shown in yellow, as capacity is generated, and beneficial use of dredge material for the Cheers concept, shown in pink. This alternative will leverage beneficial use opportunities as sites become available. And that wraps up the 11 alternatives formulated so far. As we move forward, we will use information obtained from this scoping period to help screen our alternatives to a smaller, focused array. This slide shows the major milestones in the Corps of Engineers planning process, but the key takeaway is that we are still very early in the DMMP process, and your input is critical as we move forward. Here's how you can provide input and feedback directly to our team. We have an email inbox set up specifically for this project, or you can mail your comments to our district office in Buffalo. Please also visit our website for additional information on this project and others in your area. A link is included in the video description. Thank you again for your time and your interest in this project.